The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke in the 14th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he held them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, "Give this person your place," and then be disgraced you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher," and then you'll be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And he said also to the one who had invited him, "And when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
So I was thinking this week, reflecting when I was a little bit younger, it used to terrify me for my teacher to call my name and ask me to come forward and give my presentation for a project that I had done, or my report, or even just to stand up at my desk and do it. I did not appreciate it or like or look forward to it. And I can remember a time in the 7th grade that I was asked to read my essay in front of the class, and I got up to the front, and I was shaking so much I could not read it. I literally had to put it down on the table and walk away with my hands and just kind of read it from that point. And my classmates would laugh, that is, until it was their turn. We were all in the same boat. And soon we would realize that there were growing pains in learning how to formulate and present your opinions in front of other people, and that it was part of becoming a more mature student to be able to do this being able to research a topic and then present your findings to other people. And so every day I still appreciate a teacher's patience to work with their students, to fend off the fear that they might have or the careless chiding that takes place when we're in that environment, and especially to help a student dial into their gift or their ability and help them feel special. You know, our identity as children, and especially as God's children, is something to be received, and it's something to be embraced, and it's something to be nurtured. And like a teacher who helps a student to fend off the surrounding fears or who helps a student dial into that ability that they have, so also Jesus gives and lives to fend off our fears and to help us focus on our gifted nature and the Spirit-led nurture that God provides for each of us. God, through Christ, accompanies you and me so that we can grow and so that we can mature, and gracefully God tends to us and desires for our wholeness and health as spirited children of faith. But in today's world of bullying or negativism or positioning due to competition that seems to be out there, it's easy to have one's heart trampled on. And in today's world of celebrity or comparison, or even as someone called it, capitalism gone askew, we can lose sight of life's natural ebb and flow, its true pulse. As it has been said, or I've heard this phrase most of my life growing up, it's a dog-eat-dog world out there. And when I remember what that means exactly, it's a phrase that's used to refer to a situation of fierce competition in which people are willing to harm each other in order to succeed. Hear it from a different perspective. I was reading a story about a person who crabbed for a living out on the ocean. There's a crab fisherman one day was asked why he didn't put a lid on the bucket that held the day's catch of crabs that were in there. And he said, "Well, it doesn't matter. The moment one of them climbs out, the others just reach up and pull it back down." And when you think about it, in some strange ways, we can do that too with other people, even people we love. You come back down here. Be here with the rest of us. How dare you try to succeed? How dare you do well? The Apostle Paul talked a little bit about this in one of his letters when he said, "But if you bite and devour one another, beware lest you be consumed by one another." As believers, as God's people in this world, our competition, or as Luther would say, is with the world, the flesh, and the devil. But it's not with others as human beings. We're called to nurture and build each other up and to try to see the God in one another. Jesus even concluded the ministry with a final command of being loving to one another, or that word agape, which meant to be nurturing, to be kind, to be compassionate toward the other. And we find it easy to connect, it seems, with Jesus when he's talking about being a healer or being a savior or being a teacher, even being a prophet to us. But when Jesus begins to, as somebody says, meddle in our lives, you've gone from preaching to meddling now, as a cultural revolutionary, somebody who speaks up against our society and the way it works, we begin to feel a little uncomfortable. And that's a little harder to stomach, especially when we realize that he might be just preaching against me and some of the behaviors that I can exhibit towards others. So I'm thinking all these things as I read this lesson for today. And in ancient Israel society, who sat where at the dinner table conveyed a status. As clearly as today's world of having the corner office, or getting the employee of the month parking spot that helped you look like you're a better person, or gets the most likes on your Facebook or your Instagram. Our lives are full of these subtle kind of status signals, and we use them to communicate who we are and how we want others to see us. Sometimes it's even our clothing or the kind of vehicle we drive, or even if we have one. I remember when I was in high school and I didn't quite have one yet, I had to share my Ford Fairlane station wagon that my parents had with my other siblings to get around. That was really cool. But we realize that these things that we use in our lives can sometimes be a message sender about our worth or our prestige, and we let those be the things that people think about us. And these signals were conveyed in Jesus' time by seating at a meal, like we heard in today's story. And the seating as arranged by the host wasn't just a signal, it was also a tool that the host could use. If you hosted a dinner and you wanted the advantageous marriage match with a certain young man for your daughter, you could just seat her father or his father a little higher place at the table than they usually would get, and they would feel pretty special, and they go, hey, this is a nice family to be into, and would get them to think about it. Or if you had a competitor in business that shorted you on a deal, you could let them sit lower at the table to kind of communicate your displeasure with them. And as it turned out, seating at the table was like a currency back in the day. And it was the stage on which political and social relationships were played out. And it was the public display of an individual's or a family's place on the spectrum of honor and shame. One of the most interesting parts, I think, of today's gospel story is what Jesus does not say. He doesn't say, hey, this entire status by seating system is kind of bogus, and I want you to chuck the whole thing. Instead, though, he kind of proceeds on the assumption that we will work and live within this system, that this seems to be a part of our human way of dealing with things. And Jesus says, so when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place so that when your host comes, they just might say to you, hey, come up to a higher place. Friend, move up. And then you'll be honored in the presence of all of those who are at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves are going to be humbled. But if you humble yourself, you just might become exalted. Now think for a moment, if you're in a situation like that, just what it feels like to jockey for position, especially if you're not one of the alpha people in the room. The competition is there, or the unspoken or subtle put-downs, or the unfairness of who's rewarded and who's shoved to a lower rung. It can be hurtful. It can be humiliating. And it can also be exhausting. But Jesus responds about our call to be humble, and let that be kind of a sense for us. Be humble. So I was thinking about that, and I read a story this week about Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali was this world-famous boxer, and he had a pretty big ego, and he was often in this ring, and he was touting himself and, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. Anyway, I read this story where he was reported to have boarded an airplane, and this was about the height of his career. Feeling pretty good about himself, he resisted the instructions of the flight attendant. She tells him to buckle up repeatedly, several times, and Ali says, Superman don't need no seatbelt. And the stewardess, without missing a beat, replied, well, Superman don't need no airplane either, but I don't see you flying anywhere. so buckle up. And so he swallowed his pride and he buckled up. You know, after he did kind of go through that stage, he became a more humble person. He even became someone who advocated for the Olympics and also about people with Parkinson's. Jesus says all who exalt themselves will be humbled. And he's telling us as long as we search for satisfaction in ways that will put other people down, we're going to find ourselves with possibly a satisfied head, but an empty heart in the process. In delusions of grandeur even, possibly. And Jesus says all who humble themselves will be exalted. But what if the exaltation that Jesus gives to us is a liberation from all of this status system that was in place or that could even be in place today? If we decide we're not going to play that game anymore, we begin to live outwardly what God has put inwardly in our lives. I mean, sure, we will continue to do our best at work, but we're also going to look for a chance to lend a hand to somebody who might be struggling. And sure, we're going to still be a doer in this world and a giver, but we're going to look for people who might need a helper in this world. We'll appreciate what we have. We will live as what's been termed as stewards, as compassionate managers of our church, of creation, of natural resources, of the relationships that we have. And we realize how God's salvific act of Jesus being crucified on the cross, of rising from death, and abiding in our hearts through baptism, that we have been given this new life, that we've been given a place at the table. And as we gather there, God feeds our minds with Holy Word, God nourishes our soul with a meal of forgiveness, God fills our hearts with peace and compassion, and something begins to take root. We become transformed. And suddenly that craving that we have to be the most or to win at everything begins to kind of ebb and die away. This is the exaltation Jesus promised to the humble, that small act by small act, the seed of faith that's been planted in us will begin to flower, and we'll begin to sense a bit of freedom that starts to emerge in our life, where we are free to be God's people. We become transformed. You know, for most of his life, Albert Einstein, the scientist, had the portraits of two scientists on his office wall that he loved to look at. It was Newton and Maxwell. And he said he put them on this wall as role models to inspire him. But when you read about him, he said toward the end of his life, he took them down and he replaced them with two other portraits, one of Albert Schweitzer and the other of Mahatma Gandhi. Now, Albert Schweitzer won the 1952 Nobel Peace Prize for his work called Reverence for Life, where we begin to see one another as human beings on this journey on this earth we call life. He also had incredible contributions of music and theology and medicine in his life as a missionary. And Mahatma Gandhi, well, he was the 1999 runner-up for Time magazine to the top 100 people in America for the last 100 years. Number one was Albert Einstein, and he was number two. But he said this, Einstein did. He said, you know, I need new role models. He said, I want role models this time, not of success, but I want role models of humble service. You see, this is the seat that we have at the table. Now, we're getting ready to sing a sermon hymn for today, and it was picked out to highlight this message, and it will. But as I finished writing this sermon, however, I couldn't help but hear another hymn begin to percolate in the back of my head. And it started to sound, and it just came to mind. And I encourage you maybe to use it this week as a morning devotion as you get up each day. But it's ELW 712. You'll know it once I start. I'm going to say a few verses of it. But it begins this way as I thought about this passage. Lord, whose love and humble service bore the weight of human need, who upon the cross forsaken worked your mercy's perfect deed. We, your servants, bring the worship, not a voice alone, but heart, consecrating to your purpose every gift which you impart. And then it concludes with this fourth stanza. Called by worship to your service, forth in your dear name we go, to the child, the youth, the aged, living deeds to show, hope and health, goodwill and comfort, counsel, aid, and peace we give, that your servants, Lord, in freedom, may your mercy know and live. You know, I still get terrified when I get up in front of people to speak. But it's not quite the same terror that I had when I was in the 7th grade. Today it's more of a pondering in the wonderment of God's gift of presence when 2 or 3 are gathered in God's name, knowing that we will experience God's presence today as we worship, and that we're called and invited to go and share that as we go. And that's the gift of the church. We're invited and we're called to be inviting. That's the nature of the church. By God's grace and holy baptism, we have a place at the banquet table of our Lord. And then when, by the power of that same Spirit, humility and mutual love continue among us, the church can be more inviting still in our own lives every day, wherever we are. Thanks be to God. Amen.